General Motors has now revealed it will lay off workers in Ohio, Michigan, and Maryland.
15,000 jobs eliminated, a whopping 15% of the company's workforce.
Thousands of jobs and at least 3 vehicles will no longer be made.
There was no press conference, no primetime announcement, no carefully worded statement from a podium adorned with an American flag. When General Motors, arguably the backbone of American car manufacturing, quietly shifted the core of its future operations to Canada, it didn't do so with pride or transparency. It did so behind closed doors, with ink on paper and trucks on the move. What followed would blindside not only the public, but the very workers and communities that had built GM into an industrial empire. The deal was staggering in scope: multi-billion-dollar investments, strategic energy partnerships, and a long-term vision that excluded the United States altogether. New electric vehicle, EV plants would be built in Ontario. Cutting-edge battery processing facilities would rise in Quebec. Canada sweetened the deal with locked-in electricity rates for 20 years, workforce training funds, and tax incentives so substantial they effectively removed all financial friction from GM's transition. Yet none of this appeared in the American media. The deal wasn't debated in the House or Senate. Governors weren't consulted. It didn't pass through federal review boards. The details were hidden, buried deep in cross-border agreements, quietly inked by executive teams and policy architects who knew exactly what to keep from the spotlight. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now on to the video. To most observers, it seemed like a bold expansion into the EV era, but that narrative was a smokescreen. The truth? General Motors wasn't expanding, it was fleeing. It was pulling out of its home soil and setting up a new industrial stronghold in a different country. And the silence was intentional. In Michigan, the heartland of America's auto legacy, the fallout began quietly. Workers showed up to shifts only to find their stations powered down. The conveyor belt stopped. Forklifts stood idle. What little explanation was offered came not from executives, but from whispers on the factory floor. Relocation. Restructuring, optimization. All euphemisms for one bitter truth: the jobs were leaving, and they weren't coming back. Union leaders were left stunned. There had been no signs, no negotiations, no prior warning. One day, a facility was operational. The next, machinery was being dismantled and crated, shipped north under cover of logistics. Even longtime insiders admitted they had never seen a move this deliberate, this quiet, or this irreversible. For decades, General Motors had been synonymous with American industry. Its factories were symbols of pride, grit, and global dominance. Its logo, an icon of domestic manufacturing. But this relocation marked a turning point. It wasn't just about optimizing for costs or updating technology. It was a declaration. The U.S. no longer offered the stability and vision GM needed to remain. Why Canada? The answer was complex but telling. Internal documents later leaked to investigative journalists showed that GM executives viewed the U.S. political climate as unpredictable, the regulatory environment as chaotic, and the labor pipeline as misaligned with emerging technologies. In stark contrast, Canada was described as reliably pro-industry, efficient in permitting, and strategically focused on green tech integration. In essence, Canada made itself irresistible. And America, for all its legacy and influence, had allowed its house to decay. This wasn't just a corporate decision, it was a philosophical shift, a seismic move that said American soil, once sacred to American companies, was now just another square on the global chessboard. GM's move sent a chilling message to every manufacturer, policymaker, and worker watching. Loyalty to country was no longer part of the business model. Results were. And so, without fanfare or farewell, General Motors made its quiet exit, not with headlines or applause, but with forklift traffic and logistical manifest. America's industrial titan had found a new home, but the noise was only beginning. Canada didn't stumble into this win, it engineered it. While headlines in the U.S. focused on culture wars, partisan infighting, and legislative gridlock. A quieter, more strategic game was unfolding to the north. Over the past decade, Canada had been laying the groundwork for exactly this moment. And when General Motors came looking for stability and opportunity, Canada had already built the runway. It began with a fundamental shift in mindset. Canadian policymakers, recognizing the decline of traditional fossil fuel industries, committed themselves to building a clean, future-facing industrial strategy. Instead of resisting change, they embraced it and redesigned their entire manufacturing playbook around electric vehicles, battery tech, and sustainable infrastructure. Unlike in the U.S., where states often competed against each other in a race to the bottom, slashing labor protections or offering desperate tax breaks, Canada took a different path. It aligned its federal and provincial forces into a single focused mission: attract global manufacturing giants by offering long-term certainty and system-wide support. Ontario and Quebec became case studies in coordinated industrial evolution. Colleges and vocational institutions launched new EV-focused programs tailored to predicted labor shortages. High school curricula were updated to introduce green tech fundamentals. Municipalities collaborated with industry to map out infrastructure needs, installing charging stations, upgrading rail lines, and creating zero-carbon energy grids. This wasn't just preparation. It was positioning. The permitting process for clean energy projects was overhauled. Red tape was cut, not by sacrificing environmental oversight, but by streamlining approvals through modernized digital systems and interagency coordination. Environmental reviews that took years in the U.S. were completed in months in Canada. The message to automakers was clear: if you want to build the future, build it here. And the incentives weren't just generous, they were surgical. Instead of broad subsidies, Canada offered precise tools: wage subsidies for EV engineers, property tax reductions for battery developers, and a 20-year electricity rate lock that gave CFOs certainty in a volatile energy market. Behind the scenes, Canada's Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development became a command center. Officials weren't just waiting for companies to knock. They were proactively courting them with pitch decks, site plans, and prepackaged investment frameworks. It worked. GM executives later revealed that the deal with Canada wasn't just financially appealing, it was existentially comforting. Canada offered a clear roadmap and stuck to it. There were no last-minute political reversals, no governors threatening to withdraw incentives on Twitter, and no congressional hearings dragging decisions into the spotlight. Just quiet competence. And perhaps most critically, there was partnership. Canadian officials treated GM not just as a corporation, but as a strategic ally. Where the U.S. viewed industry as something to regulate or weaponize in campaign speeches, Canada positioned itself as a facilitator. This was the industrial equivalent of compound interest, a decade of smart, quiet decisions that matured into a generational win. American observers began to realize just how far behind they'd fallen. While they debated union mandates and argued over fuel efficiency standards, Canada had built a full-spectrum industrial ecosystem, one that could attract and absorb a giant like General Motors without breaking stride. This wasn't just a good deal. It was the result of a long-term vision executed with precision. And it had just redrawn the map of North American manufacturing. For the United States, the GM relocation wasn't just a business failure. It was the culmination of a decade-long policy breakdown, a missed opportunity of historic proportions, one that had been predicted, documented, and debated, yet never acted upon. The warning signs were everywhere. Government white papers dating back to 2013 had forecasted the coming wave of electric vehicle adoption. Trade journals warned that battery supply chains would define the next era of industrial dominance. CEOs testified before Congress, begging for infrastructure investments and labor training pipelines, but nothing materialized. Instead, America's manufacturing heartland was left in limbo. No unified industrial strategy ever emerged from Washington. Proposals to modernize the Detroit-Toledo corridor languished in committees. Legislation for nationwide EV infrastructure fell victim to partisan gridlock. Clean energy incentives arrived years too late, and when they did, they came wrapped in restrictions and compromises that made them ineffective. It wasn't just a failure of action, it was a failure of vision. While Canada was preparing its workforce, upgrading its grids, and smoothing its permitting processes, the U.S. was arguing over whether climate change was real. While other countries saw EVs as an opportunity to lead the future, the U.S. treated them like a political football, tossed from one administration to the next, never catching momentum. Meanwhile, corporate leaders grew increasingly desperate for clarity. General Motors executives, along with their counterparts at Ford and Stellantis, repeatedly requested standardized tax policies, faster permitting, and long-term labor funding. But instead of answers, they received conflicting state regulations and partisan rhetoric. By the time any semblance of a national plan was proposed, the damage was already done. GM had made its decision. The incentives were on the table in Ottawa. The trucks were on the road. And the workers? They were still waiting for a town hall meeting that never came. This was more than a policy failure. It was a strategic vacuum. America, once the gold standard of industrial planning, had been reduced to reaction mode, forever responding to crises, never preventing them. The world had moved forward and the U.S. had stood still. And when General Motors finally made its move, it wasn't betraying a plan. It was escaping an absence of one. The fallout was immediate. Abandoned factories in Michigan and Indiana stood as monuments to that lost decade, silent, rusting, and hauntingly familiar. Union contracts evaporated, local tax bases cratered, small-town economies collapsed under the weight of inaction. The United States hadn't been outcompeted. It had been outplanned, and the consequences were only beginning to ripple. The leak hit like a bombshell. Within 72 hours of the General Motors Canada deal becoming public, the White House was already drafting its response. President Donald Trump, now back in the political spotlight, didn't mince words. He called it a hostile act and accused Canada of waging economic warfare against the United States. And just like that, the tariff war began. It started with surgical strikes, punitive tariffs on Canadian electric vehicle batteries, finished automotive parts, and rare earth minerals critical to EV production. But it didn't stop there. By the second week, the list had grown. Aluminum, lithium, clean energy infrastructure components, even specialized software packages used in automotive AI systems. This was no longer a business dispute. It had escalated into a full-blown trade confrontation. For Trump and his allies in Congress, the GM deal represented something far more than corporate relocation. It was a symbol of American weakness, of a government unable to protect its own industrial lifeblood. In fiery speeches and national broadcasts, lawmakers labeled the move as corporate treason and called for sweeping retaliation, not just against Canada, but against any U.S. executive who followed GM's path. The rhetoric wasn't just political theater. It had teeth. New legislation was drafted to investigate companies that received federal subsidies and then shifted operations abroad. Emergency economic councils were formed to fast-track tariffs and trade barriers. Public opinion surged in favor of the crackdown, especially in states where factories had shuttered and jobs had vanished overnight. But retaliation comes at a cost. As tariffs went into effect, American automakers suddenly found themselves grappling with fractured supply chains. Raw materials became more expensive. Battery prices surged. Delays hit assembly lines that had already been slowed by years of underinvestment. Behind closed doors, industry executives were panicking. "We cannot allow this to become a blueprint for other companies," one White House advisor reportedly warned. "If Ford or Stellantis try to follow GM North, we won't have an industry left to protect." The message was clear. This wasn't just about punishing Canada. It was about sending a warning. Still, the pressure backfired in unexpected ways. Canada doubled down on its industrial expansion, using the controversy as a rallying cry for national unity. And as American factories faced shutdowns, Canada's new plants accelerated their hiring. Meanwhile, on the streets of Middle America, the consequences became painfully real. Not in boardrooms, not in press conferences, but in the quiet spaces, dealership lots, empty factories, shuttered storefronts. The war had begun. But the casualties weren't in Ottawa or Washington. They were in Ohio, in Indiana, in Michigan, and they were just the beginning. The first visible cracks didn't appear in factories or ports. They appeared in parking lots. Across Middle America, where car dealerships once stood as symbols of community prosperity, silence began to creep in. Neon signs flickered. Showrooms sat empty. Mechanics wiped down clean tools they had no use for. The floor plans, once packed with shiny new vehicles, were vacant. Not because customers weren't buying, but because the cars simply weren't coming. Within 3 weeks of the tariff war's launch, the auto retail ecosystem began to crumble. Inventory deliveries halted. Manufacturers, caught in a tangle of tariffs, supply shortages, and pricing confusion, could no longer support the constant churn of distribution. Dealerships that had operated for generations suddenly found themselves with 0 new models on the lot. For small towns in states like Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an economic collapse. In many rural communities, the local dealership was the single largest private employer. It provided jobs, sponsored school events, and anchored the tax base. And now, those businesses were shuttering overnight. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, the local Chevrolet dealer, open since the 1950s, sat in the dark. The general manager stared at a spreadsheet soaked in red ink. "The factory isn't shipping," he said, "and the banks are pulling our credit. We've got nothing to sell and no one to sell it to." Floor plan financing, an essential lifeline for dealerships, was drying up. Banks, seeing the volatility in vehicle supply, began yanking credit lines. Dealerships that used to rotate inventory every 30 days were now holding empty lots and unpaid bills. Meanwhile, consumers were getting desperate. Used EV prices surged 15% almost overnight. Supply chain uncertainty triggered panic buying, with customers traveling across multiple states just to locate an available model. The age of convenience shopping was gone. People were now entering bidding wars for vehicles that had sat untouched just a month prior. But the economic strain was only part of the story. The cultural impact hit even harder. Car dealerships weren't just places to buy vehicles, they were community hubs. They sponsored little league teams, hosted holiday events, employed multiple generations of the same families. Their disappearance wasn't just financial, it was personal. Laid-off workers shared their stories on social media. "My dad worked here for 32 years, one former service advisor tweeted. "I worked here 12. My son was supposed to intern this summer. Now there's nothing." The post went viral, one of thousands painting a grim portrait of an industry unraveling. Across the Midwest, the landscape began to shift. Dealerships turned to bankruptcy courts. Empty lots became overgrown. Local governments started bracing for lost tax revenue. Towns that had once lived and breathed automotive culture were now ghost towns. And yet, the pain hadn't reached its peak. Because while the lights went out in the showrooms, a new kind of fire was being lit in the factories. The workers had waited long enough. Now, they were done waiting. In plant after plant across the industrial heartland, the fallout from the GM exodus reached its boiling point. It wasn't just about lost jobs or missed paychecks. It was about betrayal by the companies they served, the government that failed to protect them, and a system that now saw them as expendable. The spark came in Toledo, Ohio. At a battery module plant indirectly supplying GM's Canadian transition, workers arrived to find half their line inactive and supervisors dodging questions. Within hours, the first spontaneous walkout occurred. No speeches, no press, just hundreds of blue-collar workers standing in the parking lot, arms folded, refusing to move. By the end of the week, the ripple had become a wave. The United Auto Workers Union declared an emergency strike. But this time, it wasn't just unionized workers. Employees from logistics companies, EV parts suppliers, even software vendors joined in solidarity. Telegram groups exploded. Instagram reels showed picket lines stretching for blocks. Twitter hashtags like #no more silent deals and #jobs before profits trended for days. The message was simple and unrelenting. America's working class was tired of being the last to know and the first to lose. In Detroit, a convoy of truck drivers blocked an entire port access route for nearly 24 hours. "They can't ship our jobs out if we block the exit," said one driver through a megaphone. That footage made national news and lit a fire under an already burning movement. Digital organizing was no longer a side effort, it was the main front. Workers shared real-time updates, coordinated protest sites, and even pooled emergency funds using crowdfunding apps. What unions couldn't do through formal negotiations, the internet did in days. Corporations were caught off guard. These weren't the slow-moving protests of the past. These were flash strikes, rolling shutdowns, viral testimonies. CEOs who tried to attend press events were heckled and forced to retreat. Private security became standard protocol for executive appearances, and the energy was spreading. Warehouse workers in Indiana, rail yard staff in Pennsylvania, port workers in New Jersey, all taking action, not because they worked directly with GM, but because they understood that this betrayal was contagious. If GM could leave silently, so could their employer, and no one wanted to be next. Inside boardrooms, panic set in. Supply chains froze. Contracts were breached. Shareholder meetings were disrupted by organized protests. Executives begged for intervention, but federal officials found themselves paralyzed, caught between business interests and a swelling public uprising. Even local police forces hesitated to intervene. In some cities, officers joined picket lines. One sheriff in Illinois told reporters, "I'm not breaking up a protest to defend companies that ship jobs to Canada. My brother worked in that plant." This wasn't just a labor strike anymore. It was a reckoning. The American worker had found their voice again, and this time they weren't whispering. They were shouting into microphones, live streaming from picket lines, and writing a new chapter in industrial resistance. And in Washington, the tremors were finally being felt. The chaos on the ground finally exploded into action on Capitol Hill. For years, lawmakers had debated manufacturing policies in abstract terms, tax incentives, labor rules, energy credits. But now, with factories silent, dealerships shuttered, and voters marching in the streets, the issue was no longer theoretical. It was political survival. A bipartisan coalition formed seemingly overnight. Senators from Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, states gutted by GM's exit, stood shoulder to shoulder, calling for immediate legislative action. At the first committee hearing, a Democratic senator slammed his fist on the table. "This isn't capitalism. This is cowardice, and we will not let it continue." The American Production Recovery Act was born in that moment. Drafted in record time, the bill proposed sweeping reforms. Any company that had received federal subsidies or tax breaks in the last 10 years and then moved production overseas would be required to pay back every cent, with interest. Future government contracts would include relocation clauses, forcing corporations to disclose offshoring intentions at least 12 months in advance. Executives who profited from these moves would have their bonuses retroactively clawed back. And the penalties didn't stop at dollars. For publicly traded companies, relocation disclosures would be mandatory under SEC regulations. If they failed to comply, they'd face criminal penalties for misleading investors and the public. Wall Street panicked. General Motors stock dropped 11% in a single day. Other automakers and suppliers held emergency investor calls. Legal teams scrambled to interpret the bill's implications. Lobbyists flooded Capitol Hill trying to dilute the language before it could be passed. But the public mood had shifted too far for compromise. Mayors flew in from across the country to testify. Laid-off workers packed the galleries. Cable news ran split screens of fiery floor speeches in crumbling factory towns. For once, the outrage was bipartisan, and it was relentless. The Recovery Act passed through committee in just 9 days. But the message wasn't just for GM. It was for every corporation watching. Congress had been caught sleeping once. It wasn't going to let that happen again. The bill wasn't just legislation. It was vengeance. And the momentum behind it wasn't slowing. Canada didn't blink. While chaos engulfed Washington and protests spread across American cities, Canada stood firm. In Ottawa, the Prime Minister faced questions about the General Motors deal and the ensuing tariff war. His answer was calm, calculated, and defiant. We did what any responsible government would do. We protected our future. That one sentence set the tone for Canada's entire posture. This was not a country apologizing for winning. It was a country celebrating a strategic victory years in the making. Across national news outlets and provincial parliaments, the message was amplified. Canada had finally emerged from America's industrial shadow, and it made no attempt to hide it. Behind the scenes, Canada's Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development released a detailed report outlining exactly how they pulled it off. It wasn't a sudden windfall. It was the result of nearly a decade of preparation. The seeds had been planted as early as 2012, when internal assessments warned that North America's auto industry was ripe for realignment. In response, Canada began assembling the most attractive industrial ecosystem on the continent. Provincial governments across Ontario and Quebec synchronized their industrial, energy, and educational policies. The goal wasn't just to lure one company, it was to make Canada the default choice for any company seeking to build in the clean energy space. From zoning regulations to highway construction to vocational training, every element was adjusted to support the long game. And when GM came knocking, Canada was ready. Locked-in electricity contracts, streamlined permitting frameworks, a skilled, government-trained labor force, federal and provincial funding, and most importantly, no political volatility, no sudden reversals, no changing priorities every election cycle, just policy as promised. Canadians rallied behind it. National polls showed more than 70% of citizens approved of the GM deal. Canadian media framed it as a turning point, a declaration that Canada was no longer a junior partner in North American manufacturing, but a sovereign industrial power in its own right. Even political rivals in Parliament agreed. The deal, they argued, was not just about jobs or technology, it was about identity. Canada, for the first time in decades, had made a move that shifted the continental balance of power. And while American lawmakers rushed to punish companies for leaving, Canadian officials worked on expanding their gains. Within weeks, new negotiations began with European and Asian automakers. Several signed letters of intent to explore partnerships in Ontario's EV corridor and Quebec's lithium sector. Canada wasn't just defending its win, it was doubling down. When asked about the backlash from Washington, Canada's Deputy Minister of Industry offered a cold response. If the U.S. can't protect its own manufacturing base, that's not our concern. We're building for the next century, not reacting to the last one. With each statement, each press conference, each new deal, Canada's position became clearer. It wasn't retreating, it was ascending. And the cost of America's missed decade was becoming more visible by the hour. The old alliance, built on decades of cross-border collaboration and trust, was crumbling. And a new reality was setting in. The U.S. had underestimated its neighbor, and now that neighbor was leading. For nearly 3 decades, the North American auto industry operated as a single, interconnected machine. Cars were no longer built in just one country. They were assembled in stages, across borders. A steering wheel might be manufactured in Mexico, attached to a frame built in Michigan, and wired with electronics from Ontario before rolling off the line. That integration, powered by NAFTA and later USMCA, was a marvel of modern supply chain engineering. It kept costs down, productivity up, and jobs flowing in all 3 countries. But when General Motors rerouted its investments in infrastructure into Canada, that delicate system began to unravel. Fast. It didn't happen with a single explosion. It happened with a quiet grinding, like the gears of a great machine slipping out of sync. Suddenly, component suppliers in Tennessee found that their contracts had been canceled or diverted. Assembly plants in Indiana sat idle, waiting on parts that had been rerouted through Canadian facilities. Rail shipments that used to flow seamlessly across Detroit-Windsor were now bottlenecked at newly congested customs checkpoints, a result of retaliatory trade policies. Mexico, once the final assembly station in the North American pipeline was left stranded. Its entire auto economy had been built around synchronized integration. When the upstream supply faltered, Mexico's factories couldn't complete their builds. Production schedules collapsed, major automakers announced delays, and foreign investors began to pull out. The collapse exposed a brutal truth. The continent's manufacturing prowess had never been equally shared. The system had worked because it was whole. Remove one pillar and the rest wobbled. Trade negotiators from the NAFTA era described the moment as a reverse earthquake, not a sudden break, but a slow-motion dismantling of everything they had spent years constructing. Cross-border trucking companies lost revenue. Ports backed up with unscheduled deliveries. Small businesses that specialized in niche auto parts, gaskets, circuit boards, wiring harnesses, found themselves shut out from the new Canadian-centric logistics plans. Even the digital system suffered. Barcode scanners, tracking software, and scheduling tools, all built for integrated movement, began failing as different national systems took over. The once fluid dance of North American manufacturing turned into a chaotic stumble. Canada, meanwhile, worked quickly to rewire the system in its favor. New trade routes were secured with Europe and Asia. Infrastructure funding poured into ports in Halifax and Vancouver. While the U.S. focused on punishment, Canada focused on diversification. And as each link in the old chain broke, the geopolitical implications multiplied. Mexico's economic ministers warned of permanent job losses. Trade forums once filled with optimism turned bitter. A sense of betrayal echoed through boardrooms and press rooms alike. The integration had worked because it was balanced, but with the GM deal tipping the scale, that balance was gone. And a new map was already forming, one that no longer revolved around the U.S. There was no siren, no breaking news alert, no last-minute rescue. The end of American automotive dominance didn't come with an explosion. It came with silence, boardroom silence, assembly line silence, showroom silence. One day, the country that had built the industry, shaped its identity, and defined its future, quietly let it go. General Motors' relocation was never just about factory addresses or financial incentives. It was a warning shot, a signal that in the 21st century, leadership isn't inherited. It's earned. And when you stop earning it, you lose it. The collapse wasn't caused by competitors. It was caused by complacency, by policy paralysis, by assuming that the world would wait while America debated itself into dysfunction. Canada didn't steal the future. America surrendered it. And now the road ahead looks very different. Factories are being built elsewhere. Data is being stored elsewhere. The next generation of cars, the ones that drive themselves, diagnose themselves, and learn from every mile, won't just be made somewhere else. They'll be imagined somewhere else. But the question that remains is this: can America rebuild not just its factories, but its focus? Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.